It's a pleasure to welcome you here today and to introduce Onora O'Neill, who's the principal of Newnham College at the University of Cambridge, to speak to us today about science, accountability, and public trust. This is the fourth major event that the Center for Ethics in Science and Technology has sponsored in the previous year, and we are delighted. This is the first event that we're holding at the Salk Institute, and we began last September with a visit from Thomas Murray, the head of the Hastings Center, and then followed that up with Bill Hurlbut, a member of the President's Commission on Bioethics, and most recently at the Burnham, a one-day conference on ethics of stem cell research. And so today we turn to a larger issue about public trust. And trust, sort of like the air that we breathe, envelops and sustains the scientific endeavor. And I think like air, we notice it most when it's missing or polluted in some way or another. Among scientists themselves, I think trust occurs in several ways. Obviously, you have to trust one another, or otherwise the scientific enterprise begins anew every time. But in addition to that, for public trust, I think, is of crucial importance both for public funding and private investment for the scientific enterprise, and also, equally importantly, I think, to attract the next generation of the best and the brightest students who must be able to trust in the importance of the scientific endeavor and the way in which that is carried out. But trust seems such a capricious thing in some ways. It's given in some cases when it hardly seems justified, withheld in others when that would seem to warrant it. And that leads us to the question of when exactly is trust justified? When should it be withheld? And these, at their core, are not just psychological or political questions, but they're moral questions, questions about how we should act in particular circumstances. When we were doing the planning for today's event, when we asked ourselves, well, who could speak best to this issue of public trust and science, the first name that came to our mind with no hesitation whatsoever was Onora O'Neill's. She has been both on the front lines in regard to the issue of public trust in science, and she has made major theoretical contributions to our understanding of trust and accountability. As a member and later as acting chair of the Human Genetics Advisory Commission, as a member of the House of Lords Select Committee on Stem Cell Research, whose proposals, by the way, I think are the basis for the current British legislation on stem cell research, as the current chair of the Nuffield Foundation and the former chair of their Council on Bioethics, Onora O'Neill has greatly contributed, I think, to the creation of trust between the scientific community and the broader British public through her intellectual leadership and her personal integrity. As a philosopher, Professor O'Neill has also set the stage for future discussions of trust. After having done her undergraduate work at Oxford, she did her doctoral work with John Rawls at Harvard. She's the author of a number of key works in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant on justice, virtue, and political philosophy. And her two most recent books are precisely on the topic for today's talk, and that is on the issue of trust. Her 2002 BBC Reith Lectures, A Question of Trust, have been extraordinarily well received in the UK, and her Autonomy and Trust in Bioethics begins to raise issues about the ethics of trust that have been long neglected in the field. And both of these have been published by Cambridge University Press. So it was with great pleasure that I turned the podium over to Professor Onora O'Neill. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. It's very nice to be back in San Diego, and I'm not quite sure how many years it was since I last was here, but I suspect over 25. It looks just as nice as it did then. I suppose that it's quite surprising to find trust racing up a number of political and other agendas in the last few years. Because we've just been through a period of about 15 or 20 years in which trust has been relegated as a topic for perhaps historians and perhaps sociologists, but on the whole as something that was a bit obsolete. You know the position. Trust is like social capital. Maybe you inherit a lot of it, but then you spend it, then you don't have it, and then you have to get on without it, and that's perhaps hard. But on the other hand, in a mature society, should we really be working on the basis of trust? And in this lecture, I want to suggest why we have to take trust seriously and why current agendas for looking not so much at trust as ways in which to marginalize trust and replace it with guarantees, legislation, regulation, control, accountability, ways of securing trustworthiness, may not be working terribly well. So I begin from the thought that trust can be seen in two ways. They're not necessarily exclusive, but they are very different. Some people see trust as a matter of attitude, and they often characterize it as an attitude of acceptance, and a little bit more critically, it's deference. And other people would see trust, as I do, as epistemically grounded, that's to say, it's placed or refused on the basis of evidence. So we place or refuse trust on our basis of how we judge that in which we're asked to place trust. Now, trust in the work of anybody with expertise raises particularly acute problems. If we think of experts, scientists, other professionals, there's going to be very great difficulty if we think trust is merely a matter of attitude. Why should I trust a scientist? Well, just because I have a warm attitude towards science isn't a very good answer. And the difficulty here is, of course, greatest for the inexpert. And we're all of us inexpert in many contexts. As members of the public, we often simply cannot judge the work, the performance of people whose expertise we lack. And then it can seem that if we were to trust those people, that would be just a matter of deference, deferring to the expert. If we can't judge matters, all we can have is an attitude, and we might be duped or ill-served by experts. This, as it were, agenda of suspicion about expertise is pretty widespread, both in this country and elsewhere. Now, one thought one might immediately have is, all right, we have to close the information gap between the experts and the public. That has been the thought behind certain public understanding of science programs or agendas, and also public engagement approaches to science. But I think realistically we have to recognize that information gap generally cannot be closed. You might narrow it a little bit, but I don't think you can close it. So if working on public understanding of science is valuable, and I'm sure it is valuable, and equally public engagement with science, I suspect it's for much more specific reasons than that of closing the information gap between scientists and public. So I think the fact that we can't close that gap leaves us with a rather recalcitrant problem. Either trust is just an attitude and it's intrinsically risky when you're trusting experts, or it's evidence-based and it may still be risky, and it's particularly risky when the non-expert is considering whether to trust the expert. The evidence for riskiness is pretty good, unfortunately. Professions like to think of themselves as high-minded and careful and taking the public interest into account, but there's a great deal of evidence to the contrary of professional coziness, of what has been called by economists producer capture, meaning that a group of professionals or experts, rather than serving the public, control the service that they provide to the public and run it for their own benefit. I suppose that it's unpleasant to think about that, but I'm afraid that it's probably tremendously well evidenced. And the reason I think those of us who are in professions or have a high specialization with a lot of expertise don't like that thought is that if I say to you, well, producer capture is when the courts are run for the convenience of the judges, and the hospitals for the convenience of the consultants, and the universities for the convenience of the professors. And we like to think, well, that's not really so. Look how hard we all sweat to get it right. But there is, unfortunately, a lot of evidence of coziness and capture, and at the limit, let's face it, some evidence in science and elsewhere of corruption. So the risk isn't a myth. And that means that we have, I think, to be able to say something about why we might think it important to maintain or protect a culture of trust towards professionals, specifically towards scientists. However, that's not the way things have been heading in the last 15 years. As it seems to me, what has happened is that more and more people have bought into the thought, well, trust, that's an attitude, we better confine it to face-to-face and intimate relations, trust within the family, maybe trust of one's child's school teacher. But outside those intimate and face-to-face relationships, we can't really make sense of placing trust, so let's concentrate on securing trustworthiness. And I think that the unspoken thought behind this agenda of improving trustworthiness is very often that if we could improve trustworthiness, very generally, in the professions and beyond, then trust would be less important. People wouldn't be let down, whatever their attitude was. They could be credulous or they could be suspicious. Either way, they wouldn't be let down. But how does one secure trustworthiness if it's not by building cultures of trust? The common thought has been, well, what we need to do is to institute better control over how people do things, better managerial control, better regulatory structures, legal and regulatory requirements for how we do things, often enforced by managerial and financial incentives and penalties, but sometimes also by criminal sanctions. And the thought of some people who push this agenda is that if we got it right, then trust wouldn't matter very much. If you want to think of some broad social movements that have implicitly got this agenda, think of the move since the 1970s to regard trust in physicians as obsolete and to replace it with an emphasis on patient choice, so-called patient autonomy, and on the other hand, a highly regulated and documented form of medical practice, so that the choosing patient, despite the fact that she doesn't know very much about the operation she's choosing, won't be let down. And think also about how frequently, if questions arise about scientific practice, which is generally pretty heavily regulated in some respects, people say, oh, well, the way to deal with that is not more trust, it's more regulation. Now, I want first to suggest that even if we got to the perfect forms of control, management, regulatory, legal, and so on, that wouldn't allow us to do without trust, and here's why. The question that we need to be able to answer when we place or refuse trust is whether the person in whom we place it or the claims they make are trustworthy. And therefore they have to be held to account. And somewhere around this room there are pieces of paper with some notes on some of the things I'm going to say, so some bits I'll be a bit skimpy on. Now, accountability, as I see it, is generally a second-order matter. It's a matter of checking how people perform their basic underlying tasks, expert tasks, professional tasks, scientific work. But we know that forms of accountability themselves may not always work. Here's a famous example. A company, say called Enron, has internal financial controls, and then, to ensure that the accountability is good enough, you have a second-order financial control called auditing, done by Arthur Andersen. But what if the auditors are not trustworthy? We know where the Enron scandal led. Equally, we may require physicians to undertake continuous professional development as a way of trying to control their skill level and be sure that they are up to date. But isn't it possible that a physician undertakes that continuous professional development and yet is not a trustworthy physician? Now, some forms of scientific work, especially those that might pose risks, are subject to quite intensive regulation, but are we certain that those systems work? The problem really is that once you start raising questions about the second-order system of accountability, where do you stop? Do we need perhaps a third or nth-order regime of accountability? And even if we establish layer upon layer of nested structures of accountability, in my view a wholly dubious advantage, we can't take this through to infinity. At some point, it is clear, we have either to place or to refuse trust on the basis of such evidence as we have. So there is indeed a regress here, but it's not a regress that comes neatly to a halt. The ancient question, quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will guard the guardians, can't be answered by finding or by instituting guarantors of trustworthiness that themselves stand in no need of trust. So I think this idea of deferring the placing of trust in the hope that we'll be lucky and find a system or an institution that secures total accountability and is self-evidently trustworthy is a myth. It's just illusory. Regimes of accountability may won't improve trustworthiness, but they don't, even if they do improve trustworthiness, they don't make trust dispensable. So I don't think we can take trust off the agenda. But which forms of accountability might support trust? If the agenda cannot be replacing trust, then perhaps the agenda can be supporting the placing of trust. That, after all, is the idea of the auditor. The auditor will put the person who reads the accounts of a corporation in a better position for judging whether or not to trust the management of that corporation. However, unfortunately, some forms of accountability don't appear to be very good at supporting us when we seek to place or refuse trust. Some of them perhaps even heighten rather than dampen mistrust in experts, including scientists. I think it should give us all pause that in an era in which accountability has been strengthened in many ways, what we're actually finding is, if anything, more mistrust expressed in various professions and in some cases in scientists. So, in my view, a central aim of a good system of accountability must be to provide the evidence, the epistemic support for placing and refusing trust. It needs to be more than just a way of controlling what people do. It needs to provide a wider public, or some publics, evidence for working out whether they should place or refuse trust. And I shall argue that unfortunately some systems of accountability fail in either or both of two ways. Some may damage rather than improve the quality of professional work. They simply don't improve the trustworthiness of professional performance, and that's pretty sad. Others do not offer an adequate evidence base for non-experts to judge when or whether to place or refuse trust. Some, of course, may fail in both respects. Now, I'm going to look very schematically at a few types of accountability regime and see how they might work and how well they achieve the various objectives we want. And I'm going to start with client-centered accountability and say something about its critics. You might say consumer accountability or accountability to consumers. Now, expert practice faces quite distinctive problems when it tries to depend on client-centered views of accountability. And they would be particularly serious problems if we tried to rely on client-centered accountability for scientists. Think about the old slogan, caveat emptor, buyer beware. Well, consumer choice is sort of got that little slogan in the background, but it's often too weak a standard for accountability if those on the receiving end can't judge the performance. Caveat emptor may be quite okay when you're buying an apple, because we all know how to judge whether it's ripe and whether it's bruised and that sort of stuff. But it's quite another when we're choosing, let's say, a vaccine for a child, or deciding which waste disposal technologies a city should invest in. Information asymmetry is far too great and creates real problems for individuals and for citizens in trusting experts on the basis merely of client-centered accountability. So I think we can set aside as fantasy that we can solve problems of trustworthiness in areas of high expertise by relying on consumer or client choice. There are some things that market arrangements by themselves can't deliver. If anybody doubts that, think of the commercial success of some dodgy financial services, or alternatively some dodgy alternative remedies for serious diseases. It's perfectly possible to get things past members of the public when they don't have the relevant information. I think this has two implications. Accountability for scientists often cannot be achieved by client or consumer-centered approaches, even when the scientific work, as is not always the case, is done or sold to individuals. Secondly, even if it could be achieved by these methods, this wouldn't begin in cases where it's done for individuals, this wouldn't work where the work affects a wider public. This is often the case with scientific work. Again, think of environmental issues as the obvious case in point, or think of public health issues. Much scientific work affects a wider public, and you can't define the people whom it affects as clients or consumers. And so we at least need a form of accountability that is sensitive to public interest as well as individual interests. Consumerist approaches are not going to be enough for scientific work. Now, the next model of accountability that we might look at is that of professional accountability. Traditionally, this has been very important, and professional bodies and codes have gone far beyond consumerist views of accountability. Professional accountability generally seeks to do something to ensure the quality of work and to ensure proper attention to client and public interests, not just client interests. And the traditional panoply of professional training, certification, professional codes, disciplinary bodies, and so on is meant to ensure this. But in recent decades, one's all too aware that professional structures have been criticized for condoning, or at very worst, encouraging professionals, scientists among them, to neglect some of their proper tasks. There's where the charge of professional capture or coziness comes back. I think it's a moot point, and I'd be very interested to hear your views of this, whether this is a more or less serious issue for scientists who are not, after all, an incorporated or chartered or registered profession. I'm not sure of the US vocabulary here, who have a number of professional disciplines, nevertheless, which they take extremely seriously, such as peer review or accurate disclosure of evidence and so on, and yet whose practice is quite impenetrable to many non-experts. Basically, the charge of professional capture is that professional accountability is only a form of self-regulation, and that those who merely self-regulate always settle for a form of accountability that lacks sufficient independence, and they condone or even favor self-interest at the expense of clients and at the expense of the public interest. This charge has become more salient, more serious, in a world where much scientific work, including much that's publicly funded, is closely bound up with commercial objectives, where competition is not just for priority or glory, but for hard cash and the bottom line. But it's also been, I think, exacerbated by developments in patenting that blur the distinction between invention and discovery, and by practices which protect smaller and smaller inventive steps, which can, at the limit, allow the effective exclusion of others from certain lines of research, thus, as it were, undermining the traditional purpose of the patenting regimes. So there are difficulties with professional accountability, but I think it has more to be said for it, and I'll come back to that. First, I want to consider the obvious alternative, which is regulatory accountability. In the developed world, we have seen, of course, great reliance on regulatory approaches. Self-regulation has often been replaced by statutory regulation. Famous regulators like the FDA in this country regulate with great intensity, and if one wanted to make the case for this approach, it is that they aim to ensure independently that professional work meets prescribed standards. They impose requirements from outside and enforce them, often with penalties, sometimes financial, sometimes even criminal. Yet, regulatory structures that monitor and control professional work can, in fact, damage it. They can distract and distance professionals from their proper tasks. Some humble examples. Some regulatory regimes conflate accountability with management. They work by imposing extremely detailed requirements, objectives, targets, protocols, penalties, controls, more penalties, often from afar, often without adequate information or understanding of the work that they are regulating. I think this is particularly likely when scientific work is done in publicly funded institutions or in the public sector more generally. Second example, regulators may, in their quest for control and accuracy, rely on performance indicators of a very simplistic sort as substitutes for expert judgment. After all, they mistrust expert judgment of quality of performance of complex tasks. They may even defend doing this as a way of ensuring that accountability is independent and objective. But when the targets chosen at a distance by funders or regulators are ill-chosen, they may actually be incompatible with good performance, and they are very likely to create perverse incentives. I suppose that a sort of caricature image of this is the case where you go onto the hospital ward and the nurse is watching a screen, a monitor, and not the patients. These requirements, therefore, create real difficulties for professionals and experts. One has to attend so much to the regulation that one may attend less to the primary tasks and responsibilities. And so, you know better than I do how this bears on scientists in this country. I know scientists in the UK who find that they spend an awful lot of time managing labs and projects to minutely specific protocols that don't necessarily improve the quality of safety, science, or anything else. They have to spend a great deal of time seeking funds by using procedures which may create tremendous and risky incentives to exaggerate tentative findings and to pursue commercial advantage at the expense of scientific publication. All of these activities, these mandated activities, have opportunity costs. People can spend less time with their colleagues, less time with the work. They may find that professional disciplines atrophy. They may find that a culture of competition is entrenched where it shouldn't be. In effect, regulatory regimes can incentivize defensive practice. We all know about defensive medical practice. What about defensive scientific practice? We also know that the very structures that incentivize defensive medical practice have incentivized aggressive medical practice? Do they incentivize aggressive scientific practice? And if we reach aggressive medicine and aggressive science, have we reached defective medicine and defective science? So when regulatory accountability fails to curb these tendencies or even sharpens them, professional standards, far from being reinforced in a more objective and independent way, are likely to slip, and the effectiveness of professions, professionalism, and professional bodies will be reduced. So I think all three of these areas raise very considerable difficulties for us. Consumer accountability, client-centered accountability is too weak. It doesn't take information asymmetry seriously. It is negligent about issues of public interest. Professional accountability at least takes public as well as client interest seriously, but it's short on independence, so it may shortchange both interests. Regulatory accountability is indeed more independent, but it may be short on informed judgment and expertise, so may labour to secure accountability for the wrong things. Intelligent accountability, I think, would have to be slightly different from each of these in that it would have to combine informed and independent judgment. Now, I think that professional accountability has been on the right track in some respects. It was right in that it starts with an informed view of the primary tasks of professionals. One knows what has to be done by a physician, by a scientist working on a particular project, by an academic. Professional accountability was right because it focuses on tasks, not targets. Tasks are specified by descriptions of the action that is to be done or that is not to be done in various situations. The problem with professional accountability, as noted, was lack of independence. But the converse problem of the regulatory and managerial forms of accountability is that they achieved independence only at the cost of veering towards an uninformed view of tasks and then gave in to the temptation to settle for a focus on targets and often just rather illusory performance indicators. That might have secured independence, though I'm not so sure, but it certainly does damage to the quality of professional and expert work, and of course to morale. That is also important when we undermine the morale of experts who try extremely hard to do very difficult things, and then at the end of it we either subject them to Mickey Mouse procedures of accountability or tell them that they're not trusted. Note also that unless target-driven accountability of that sort could actually replace professional accountability, there wouldn't be any gain. Either informed approaches to accountability would be lost, so no gain, or they would be retained, and the target-oriented forms of accountability would amount to an additional requirement. Now, I want to say a little bit about the formal structure of accountability, and the handout sets this out, so I'll go rather fast, but the abbreviations are obvious. I think that in thinking about accountability, we have to begin with a view of the tasks which experts do. Only if we can specify what they ought to do can we start thinking about them being accountable for so doing. And accountability is just going to be unintelligent and useless if it omits an informed account of what could be done. So I'll break into this about halfway down the page, say on item 4. Certain tasks ought to be done by one individual. There may be another who has a right to its being done, but I'm not very interested in rights on this occasion. And the person who ought to do it has a second-order obligation to do that. I think somehow that 4 is not the one I wanted to break in on, shift to 5. Now, this sounds simple. The thought, namely, that I'm accountable for a certain action if, in addition to having an obligation to do an action, I have to render an account of my performance to somebody else. But it gets immensely complicated in a complex, high-tech society because many types of action are required. There are many people of whom they are required, experts of different sorts. There may be many others with a right to certain sorts of performance. And there are many agents and institutions to whom we are variously accountable for the quality of expert performance. So number 6 sets out the general structure of accountability. Now, where did trust go in that? Well, it sort of ducked out sideways, but I hope I've kept the way of getting back to trust. An intelligent approach to accountability is not able to dispense with trust. That follows from one of the arguments at the beginning of this lecture. So if trust is not dispensable, intelligent accountability is going to be incomplete unless it provides ways for members of the public to decide whether to place or whether to refuse their trust intelligently. Now, that's not so easy. I believe it cannot be achieved by mere dissemination of information. Dissemination of information achieves transparency and openness, and it allows the public to tell whether performance has been adequate or inadequate, fair or unfair, judged by those ways of measuring it. But frankly, neither league tables nor shoveling facts and figures onto websites is an adequate way of communicating, possibly with fellow professionals up to a point, but certainly not with the public at large, who don't have time or expertise to sift and use what is disclosed. So that it seems to me that we neither can achieve trust by trying to construct league tables. All of us hear about top-ranked or world-class laboratories or universities or companies, but that very vocabulary with the thought that you can rank on a single dimension has become suspect. Ease of ranking is on the whole not a convincing piece of evidence, doesn't supply convincing evidence for anybody. So in my view, the world of league tables and transparency hasn't done very well by providing the public with the evidence they need for placing or refusing trust. Transparency is, of course, the sort of thing you're not meant to criticize, at least it's politically very incorrect, so I'll do it. Consider why it's not necessary first. Some forms of transparency actually damage accountability. They create their own perverse incentives. When transparency, which, as you know, is often, as it were, implemented or backed by freedom of information legislation, is taken to require the rather indiscriminate publication of all working papers and internal memoranda, this may actually deter and damage good work within the institutions. Time and energy get diverted into what's essentially defensive activity. Position papers may minimize or omit serious discussion of options that can get a bad press or depress share prices or provide information that competitors might use. Papers may be drafted more to support a public relations agenda than to provide accurate working records. Even more damagingly, the demand for ubiquitous transparency creates incentives to do more things outside meetings, in private conversations, as chairman's action, in unminuted phone calls, etc., etc. So misplaced transparency requirements, I think, can damage good work on policy, sound management, expert judgment, scientific judgment, institutional integrity, even democratic process. But in a way, the worst problem is that transparency isn't enough for accountability to wider publics. Just making information available is a very good antidote to secrecy. If you've made it available, it's no longer secret. But it usually doesn't achieve adequate standards of communication with wider audiences. Communication that works for some audiences won't work for others. And the advocates of transparency have, I think, been wildly over-optimistic in thinking that mere requirements for public, commercial, charitable, scientific or academic institutions to disclose or disseminate information is going to make their work genuinely transparent to all audiences. They're wildly naive in imagining that what is disclosed is just going to reach the wider public without intervening manipulation by many interested parties, the media, campaigning groups, advocates of alternative and cult approaches to areas of expertise, commercial rivals. I've already noted that scientists are sometimes guilty of hype and sensationalism, but they're hardly the worst practitioners of these black arts. We have not, I think, really taken in the full difficulties of maintaining serious accountability for expert performance in public cultures where many voices dispense themselves but owe not others, not the experts, from any standards of accountability. So in short, transparency is only a matter of making material available, of disclosure. It doesn't mandate and often doesn't achieve good communication. Who likes transparency and why do they like it? Well, it's a boon for some related and rival institutions, sometimes for NGOs and campaigning groups with professional capacity, because these groups have an agenda of criticizing others' performance, but they do have sufficient expertise to read what other experts disclose. But that sort of transparency isn't too useful for the wider public. They often can't understand the relevant information, can't see the wood for the trees, can't assess what they read, can't see what's missing, can't fit the parts together, and above all, do not have time to take an active and constructive part in scientific debate. Unlike carrier pigeons, or do you call them homing pigeons, information doesn't automatically flap its way to relevant audiences. Now, some effort to overcome the gap between expert and public has, of course, been made in the public understanding and public engagement with science agendas. That works a bit, sometimes, with some members of the public, but there's very great empirical evidence of the limits of these approaches, and also very great empirical evidence of the resistance of popular beliefs to these worthy endeavors. Popular beliefs are very often reinforced by the mass media or commercial interests. It's somebody else's product, that alternative remedy, that does no good or perhaps some harm. And it's, I think, an illusion to think that transparency is going to dent that. So in the end, one of the main limitations of the transparency culture and of the sort of managerial accountability culture to which it's linked is a trivializing view of communication. What's really needed is to achieve intelligibility to and accessibility by relevant audiences, and transparency doesn't do enough. I've already mentioned to some people here that one scientific group that I think was rather successful in this, and that was the scientists at the Roslin Institute in Scotland who cloned Dolly the sheep, a charming sheep, by the way. And they were in a very, very exposed position. The British public loves little furry animals. It has a sort of horror, yuck response to reproductive cloning. How did they manage to come out of it looking pretty good? One of the things they did was that they corrected very soberly and very factually any misrepresentation in the media within 12 hours. Secondly, they did it themselves. The person who did the correction was somebody who knew and did the science, not a so-called communication strategist who, when the first clever question was lobbed by a journalist, was, of course, at the end of their knowledge. I think that's quite an instructive example. Now, just to turn to the second page of the handout with which I shall finish, I think that if we're to have intelligent placing and refusal of trust, we need intelligent forms of accountability. And those intelligent forms of accountability will have to start where all professional and expert work starts, with a clear account of the basic tasks for which somebody is to be held accountable. And that they will have to be held accountable indeed by somebody who is independent, not by themselves. Self-regulation has, bluntly, an extremely bad reputation when it comes to, a well-earned bad reputation, when it comes to real issues of malperformance. Self-regulation works quite well. There's good evidence for this, for, as it were, the daily grind. But when somebody has misperformed, there is a very strong tendency to close ranks. So intelligent accountability, I think, requires us to combine a way of securing informed judgment of expert performance with independent judgment of expert performance. Now, there's an old sort of chestnut where you say, well, look, you can have one or the other, but those who are informed won't be independent, they'll be colleagues of the other experts, and those who are independent, who aren't colleagues of the relevant experts, won't be informed enough. You have one or you have the other, so we need some form of regulatory accountability and nothing else. I think that's all an exaggeration. I think there are ways of securing an adequate degree of independence, for example, on complaints bodies and regulatory bodies, by appointing lay people, non-scientists, to those bodies, and equally enough scientists to make sure that judgment is sufficiently informed. But even when you've got informed and independent judgment, you need a third thing for intelligent placing of trust, and that is intelligible communication to specific audiences. Not just distribution or dissemination or disclosure, transparency, openness or freedom of expression, but intelligible communication directed to relevant audiences. I think I'm going to stop there. I'd sooner hear your thoughts, and I apologize for the fact that my knowledge of the regulatory structures in the US is limited, and so I've taken more of my examples from the UK situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Onora. We have time now for questions from the audience. And we have, I think, we have two roving microphones. So if you raise your hand, then one or the other person can come over to where you're sitting. Yes.
My name is Phil Schwartz. I run a stem cell research lab up in Orange County, and I also teach a course on human embryonic stem cells, so I'm quite immersed in the field. And since you've been a part of that, I think it's an instructive example of perhaps how trust has been either misplaced or violated by scientists in moving this field forward. And in some respects, I think they've abdicated their responsibilities by letting patient advocacy groups move the impetus for funding this program forward. And another one, I think they've actually participated in misleading the public by changing nomenclature in midstream to try to avoid contentious issues, cloning being one of them. And do you think that, these are important, timely considerations given what you've been talking about? And do you think they're really putting us as scientists at a disadvantage now?
I'm not as familiar with the US debate, but I am going to talk a bit about the UK experience later this afternoon. I think one very general comment I'd make, which is quite a difference between the two cultures, is that issues of reproductive medicine have by and large been resolved in a democratic forum in the UK and in a legal forum in the US. That's to say that the key decisions of the 1960s and 70s, Griswold v. Connecticut, Roe v. Wade, on respectively on contraception and on abortion, were decided in court rather than as a result of democratic process. And I think that has colored everything subsequent. And if the UK has reached more of a consensus on the regulation of reproductive medicine, it has been as the outcome of very hard-fought public and parliamentary debates in which, as you noted, the patient research groups, the parent groups, the infertility groups, all had a very considerable input, and of course the religious groups. Now, some might say it's not ideal to sort these questions out by democratic process because there's a right and a wrong, and that isn't determined by how the votes fall. And that's a reasonable thought on some matters, but it's a very difficult criterion to apply in an area where there is enormous dissent and disagreement. So that in the end, we too had the patient support groups and the medical research charities taking a certain view, and a few of the churches taking a different view, and we too had the infertility lobbies taking a different view. One quite fascinating and bizarre thing to me is that quite stably, from an opinion poll done just after Dolly the sheep was announced, until today, 20% of the British population think that reproductive cloning would be an acceptable fertility treatment. 20%. However, we have made it illegal. So, to my mind, yes, there are some issues of nomenclature, how the word cloning is used, how the word embryo is used, but they actually probably, when you look, as it were, who might gain rhetorical advantage by the terminology, probably advantage has gone both ways on these points. That's not a full answer. I'm slightly avoiding things I'm talking about later on.
Peer review provides an opportunity for accountability, but there are two kinds of accountability we might worry about. One is the quality of the science, that it really is good science. And I suspect that if we trust peer review to do a good job of that, and for the most part it probably does, but not always, even though not always, that's something we might ask, how can we make sure that the public understands that that's happening? And my suspicion is that, at least in this country, the public does not understand that mechanism.
I'm sure that's true. We've just done a piece of work on that through a little group called Sense About Science in the UK, and understanding is very slight.
Okay, so that part is in some senses the easier part. The other question, which I think some of us are worrying about and is implied by a lot of your talk as well, is that the public may not trust scientists to be doing the right thing, which is then more an ethical question. Does peer review do anything to ensure that the science that's being done is not just good science, but it's ethical in every sense of the word, not just protecting human subjects, but also perhaps approaching directions that are good directions? I'll leave it to you.
I'd like to divide that last bit in that there's one thing the public rightly worry about, which is the agenda. Why does work in certain areas get funded and certain other areas not get funded? And that seems to me an absolutely legitimate public interest thing. And if the public think there should be more work on a particular area, then I think publicly funded funding bodies do have a very clear steer about what to do. And we all know there's little snide articles about some piece of research that seems to the journalist peculiarly inane, pointless and useless, and something nobody ever wanted to know about at all. So there it's one story. But if it's not about the direction of research, but as it were, judging who should get the grants, I find it much more difficult to see that we can have public involvement there, in that the understanding of the grant is so important, of the work is so important. But what we can have, and some journal editors after all push this sort of thing, is a good deal of clarity about conflict of interest. I didn't say anything about conflict of interest yet, but I think it's something where most professions have been far too casual. There really is every reason to think that if one doesn't take conflict of interest really seriously, at least some people sometime will, as it were, lean in the direction where their interest lies but is not known to lie. And some people will do much worse than that. And I find it surprising that we can see, for example, in the corporate world and increasingly in the political world, and in civil service in Britain, very stringent requirements on the declaration of interest, standing down from participation if you have even the perception of a conflict of interest, and the way in which this is carried through in other areas. So I think there could be more things of that type where we and perhaps we should support the editors of the journals rather strongly, or alternatively put pressure on the editors where they're not doing a good job in this respect. I think it is very disturbing that Dr. Wakefield's paper on MMR jabs for children was published in The Lancet, and then some years later a financial interest is disclosed that leads the editor to say, had I known, I'd not have published. I think he should have known, but I would come back to something that some of you here are in a very strong position to do something about, which is that the leader of a research group sets standards and doesn't have to set the standards that are the average for the field everywhere. And I think there really is a role for leadership here, and for making it clear to colleagues at the start of their career that what it's about is not conforming to the protocols, but actually thinking it through, seeing what the implications are, and seeing what sort of scrutiny it would stand up to. We all read those horror stories about some 19th century medical experiments, or worse in the 20th century, that used people as victims. But it's very hard for people to see that that sort of question should be absolutely part of daily routine. I've taken part in some Wellcome Trust seminars when they were considering funding research in the Third World. And what they wanted to be sure out of this seminar was that they were not overlooking the interests of the research participants and the communities through which they came. And that seems to me, again, an agenda which research leaders can take very seriously.